You're all set.
All right, thank you, Summer. All right, I'm going to call the Moab City Council meeting to order, a regular meeting on August 22nd, 2023 at 6:02 p.m. And Colin Topper, would you mind leading us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, we're going to start off our meeting with a workshop, item 2.1, Water Efficient Landscaping Ordinance 2023-08, an ordinance amending the text of the Moab Municipal Code, section 17.06 definition, 17.09 supplementary requirements, procedures applicable within zones, and creating chapter 17.10 landscaping standards to add water efficient landscaping standards with review and approval procedures. We had a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and basically we're kind of finishing up that workshop tonight. There was an section on screening and buffering that we didn't get to at the last meeting. There have been, my understanding, there's a few minor changes based on input from the council. So tonight we're going to just finish up that presentation. Hopefully you guys are going to be able to give some more input, and then we'll have it for consideration at our next meeting. So I'm going to turn it over to Lexi and Corey.
Thank you. Good evening. Anna is going to share a screen. We're just getting the Zoom link up and running here. But to introduce essentially what this introductory section is finishing out that framework overview, as the mayor has mentioned, specifically about that screening and buffering requirement. Within that, we have essentially broken out what some of the existing framework is into a standard buffering zone and zone boundary buffering areas. There's criteria within each of those that we can review tonight. Most of the material is going to be a walkthrough of essentially what is in the ordinance itself. We're going to try not to get into that level of material unless there are specific questions on some of those metrics that we would be reviewing. And there we go.
Still connecting. Okay, so just a little bit of an introduction, because Corey's going to go over this more extensively on what's going on with the current ordinance. We do have screening and buffering, but there isn't really a whole lot of definition in it, and there isn't a lot of clarification. So what we want to do is make it so that it's more clear as far as a function for us when we do development on the screening and buffering on ordinances. We want to break down what the difference between a buffer and a buffering is, a screening and landscape screening and that type of thing, so that we can have more clarification. We also are going to make it so that there's going to be differences between the types of buffering, like there's going to be a zone boundary buffering and the standard buffering. Zone boundary buffering is going to be robust than the standard buffering is. Here's like a diagram, an example of the difference between the two. Standard buffering is two uses that are allowed in the same zoning district, but one might be more intense than the other type of use. So we're just going to have like a narrower and width buffer, and then also maybe less landscaping, and then a 6 foot tall fence. When we come to zone and boundary buffering,
that means that we're going to have a residential zone against a commercial or industrial type of zone or non-residential zone, then the boundary is, or the buffer width is going to be wider, and then there's going to be more dense as far as vegetation goes, and then taller fences. You can see that on these diagrams down here. So this is kind of an example of what we would see, or what we would want to see when we do our reviews on landscapes and buffers, buffer requirements and that type of thing. Again, so an example of a zone boundary is a C4 zoning and is adjacent to the R3 zoning. The specific use doesn't matter as much as the zoning districts, versus the standard buffering is used when a higher intensity use abuts a lower intensity use, but they're both in the same residential zone. And that's multi-household abutting a single family household. So that is what we are proposing. And then we also are going to have more clarification as far as buffer landscape requirements and screening requirement. And we're going to include more flexibility, such as when there's certain circumstances involved with the land, like views and noise levels or something like that, where what the standard buffering that is allowed for ordinance isn't going to work, then they can go through a special exception process so that they can make it work better, or we could get a better development permit. So that is the overview. Does anybody have any questions?
Let's keep going.
Perfect. Thank you. In that matrix that you had seen earlier, that was based off of 100 linear foot. That's essentially what we're going to be operating on the smallest common denominator of a conforming lot. So those numbers that you're seeing are going to be practical numbers for most common residential lots are going to be seeing. Of course, larger lots are going to have expansion on those ratios. And then Anna, will you drop down two more?
This one?
Last one.
Okay, so the exceptions.
Perfect. Yeah. So within this slide, what we're evaluating, this is going to come up a little bit later, but is in these determinations of what we're moving away from is a zoning administrator review of combination and mitigative aspects. But what we've come through in recent processes and site plan reviews is essentially identifying what are the independent features, the intensity, and uses. And so what we've done is, rather than having that be a loose combination conglomerate, is a static matrix review. So we've broken those utensils out and designed them specifically that it can be more reliable and more consistent for a developer to look at and develop off of, ensuring that it's going to meet kind of standard permitted code. But that really does clear that all up. So if there's no questions, we might jump over to Alexi to pick back up with the general ordinance. Yes.
So in the illustration, and given the way that sites are developed as intensely as possible, it seems like canopy trees may end up quite close to buildings. And I think that's specifically prohibited in the street tree section. So I'm wondering if there's so that's a question, like, does that exist, and is that a problem? And then secondly, it seems like maybe this will be handled in the exceptions, just like if there's overhead utilities along a property line, like you would just treat that as an exception and not require.
Correct. The starting basis is essentially a consistent framework across the boundary. And then, of course, if there are, whether it's flood zones, if there are cliff faces, erosive soil areas, specific conditions, we can handle each of those specifically and subjectively through a land use authority review versus what would be at a zoning administrator process to kind of exempt those. As far as the first question goes, as far as maintenance, that's a very we've reviewed that at the Planning Commission at a number of occasions, how that maintenance schedule is going to actually work out. Depending on the type of development, whether it's a private maintained property or a subdivision, how those CCNRs or maintenance agreements, even with an individual, are going to be managed. But getting to the base of that is that we're not putting the burden of maintenance onto a neighbor that is not developing. So the maintenance of these screening bufferings is going to remain within the property of development. So the proximity, and depending on what species you're proposing, it may have to be maintained at more of a linear perspective than what would be an oval or circular perspective of that canopy within, as healthy of a possible way as, would be achievable. But thank you. That maintenance was an important profile that we did want to clarify coming off of the Planning Commission.
You stop sharing and I'll switch over.
Okay, so first I'm going to hit the changes that we've made. And then I'll go to the water budget, and then it'll be open to any other questions or comments that people have. So we added a few definitions. None of them were substantive in that they would change the meaning of the code, or that was not intentionally done. They were just requested for clarification. So effective precipitation rate. Sorry, I'll stop when we get to them. Secondary water. And then the next change was a clarification on the indoor water conservation standard to make it clear that it was all lodging units and new residential dwelling units, with the intention that the fixtures that are able to be water sense would be covered, or the appliances that are able to be Energy Star would be covered. So the intent stayed the same, but we did change the language just a little bit. And then there were some changes in our trees section. We added private street trees. That was a question we posed to council last time. Our recommendation is that private streets are included. It's a matter of managing urban heat island effect throughout the city and equity, having equal access to trees within the communities. And we don't necessarily want to treat private streets and public streets differently in that way. So it appears here, and then we made a small change later at the bottom of that code, I believe too, where it specifically states private, but the effect is just that all streets would be encompassed by this. And I believe those are the significant changes that we made. Nothing too big. Are there any questions on those changes?
I had a couple of questions for you. I don't know if it brought this up or if it's written in here that I can't see it. What about people? Is there an exemption for people who have irrigation shares?
There's not an exemption. What we did is we put it into the water budget as a bonus, similar to having a native landscape or having other special features that we wanted to give incentives. So if you have surface water irrigation, then you would be able to have more water use in your landscape through that bonus.
So that is accounted for in there. Okay.
Can I follow up on that just while
Yes.
we're on it?
Yep.
So I was unclear if you were using surface water irrigation to mean flood irrigation or meaning you're using secondary water. And secondary is defined and
Yeah, the intention was secondary, not flood. And we did try to clarify that.
okay, because I think in the water budget, you use surface water.
I'll have to check to see if we changed the word there. We may have, in order to try to clarify that, because I think that was one of the comments that you made. But if we did not, we will.
Okay.
Then my next question is on enforcement. And I'm wondering if, so this enforcement is not new. This is from the old ordinance. And I'm just kind of curious if the old ordinance has been enforced.
Regarding specifically
Specifically, there's things in here that says, that yards will be maintained and, they'll be mowed, that there won't be weeds growing in the yards, and stuff like that. And how that's going.
Well, this year in particular, with the wet spring that we've had, and as you can tell around the city, we've had an issue with weeds. We've issued, I wish Mona were, maybe she is here, over 72 violations. And there are classifications within that of severity of health and safety concerns. So the answer is we do. There's a land use category and a weed abatement category, two different sections of the code, chapter 8 and chapter 17, that we've been mutually enforcing through our new compliance system that we do have. But more specific to land use, what we're trying to maintain is maintenance of ground erosion, storm drainage, and dust, kind of those nuisance issues. But as far as the framework goes, it's actually a nice tangent, if I might continue to add on to your question about enforcement and compliance. Alexi, would you scroll down to that last section? We actually had a citizen provide comment earlier, well, later last night and then earlier today in communication, asking specifically about how maybe condos, townhomes, and PUDs or other, again, privately maintained larger property, but multiple ownership elements, how they might be integrated. Because that's, I think, a number of our communities in, say, Mill Creek, Pueblos, how that's going to work. And again, I think, Jason, you hit it nail on the head. This framework for compliance and enforcement has been brought across. So we're not adding new provisions to our general provisions for legal nonconforming, which is what we're resting on. But there are additional pieces within that.
Section do you need?
It's a little bit, excuse me, it's up, section A. So you're right there in the right place. Or one, rather. Yeah. Okay. We're in the right neighborhood. So under that subsection B, we can identify in that first subsection, proceeding with consistent provisions in the general 1712. But below that, we go on to additionally clarify some of those elements. So one thing for consideration of the council tonight could be we can continue to add clarifying language here. I would contend that it's not new regulatory provisions, but it does give, I think, a little bit more security for people in these developments, that they know how or if they're going to be regulated on, because as we're in a shared community, whether it's a PUD or a condominium development, if one particular neighbor maybe is non-conforming and they're coming through a provision process that's going to make them come up to compliance, how is that going to affect that individual's property and ownership? Is it going to be a blanket situation? And the simple answer is no. I think the language as it stands, I feel fairly confident that we've provided those provisions that each individual property is going to be treated selectively to itself. But if there is, of course, a common area, and the common is being treated through the HOA and the CC&R developments, of if they're going to go and develop over 51% of landscaping, yes, the whole development will have to come into line with that. But that's something we'll be dealing with the HOA, not the individual owners on. So there's definitely securities there as it reads now. But that was one suggestion, is just maybe clarifying that as what would be a subsection 4 there, profiling of that. But to your point of, how we're working with enforcement, and then also this very important legal nonconforming aspect of this code, which is how it will progress into compliance from where we're starting, which is unknown compliance, how compliant we are as a city. But I hope that helps frame a little bit more of that question, but sorry to interject there.
That's fine. I just want to make sure that, like, I'm always concerned that we're adding more to the ordinance, but we're not doing the enforcement part of the ordinance, and so that was just kind of.
Jason, can I just add, can you clarify about undeveloped lots and how this pertains to that? I know that this came up yesterday. Somebody complained about an undeveloped lot. It's not landscaped. That's a problem.
Sure. So if, say, there's just I think there's a couple layers to this. One is an undeveloped, meaning virgin landscape, for lack of a better word. And then there are vacant lots, meaning maybe they were previously developed and then they've been scraped, or those types of things. And so within our current code compliance spectrum, those are varying degrees of how we're dealing and working through mitigation efforts with the community. And then, of course, there are properties that are developed. You have an active use on the property, and they've just let their yard go beyond what is allowed within the land use ordinance. Everything that was prior to that, what I was just mentioning, so it's undeveloped or it's vacant, that's really into our weed abatement code, which is a health and safety issue. So there is no required landscaping if there's no use of which there is landscaping associated with. So we wouldn't be using that provision. It's purely health and safety,
Great.
specifically around kind of oddly enough, odor and then fire as well. But as this landscaping ordinance would go, any unestablished lots, meaning they don't have a legal non-conforming status, would have to come into compliance if they were to propose a new use or make amendments to that property. So they would have to come into full compliance with this ordinance now, but really wouldn't affect the weed abatement structure. Weeds are slightly detached from landscaping.
Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate that. Sorry, Jason. Anything else?
No.
Anybody else? Questions, comments for Alexi, Corey, or Anna?
I also just pulled up the water budget section. We did change it to secondary water irrigation. So confirmed it's already been done. It's okay. So the next thing that I wanted to go over was how water budgets would work. Our consultants who are also on the line with us this evening developed a worksheet for us that residents could use or that would help people get through this process. And let me switch the screen that I'm sharing. Okay. So what people could do is they would go through here, and then I'll give you some of the landscape examples. We started with them in our last meeting. So people would go through and look at different zones within their landscape and how they are being used. So that would be their water use category in hydro zones, like a high water or a water feature use, medium, low, or something that is very low or non-irrigated. And then you'd go through and pick what kind of irrigation you're using in that part of your yard. So it could be different in different parts of your yard. Maybe your lawn is spray or like overhead irrigation, and your like decorative garden has mulch and it's drip, and you would put that in, and then the size of it. So the square feet that is encompassed with those things. The calculation, we'll put together the total gallons per season and how big your yard is, and then develop an average irrigation water need for your yard. Switching to what this would look like in a yard. This would be, I think we started with this one last time. If we looked at city center, we'd look at the total amount of space we have, about 5,000 square feet, what kinds of landscape we have here, about 40% low, 60% high, mostly drip. And then we can go through with the calculator and calculate out that given that we have bonuses for our stormwater management and native plants, that instead of the regular budget of 15 gallons per square foot per season, we'd have 17 gallons. The calculation for this particular landscape is 16.1, so it would qualify. We tried to put together an option that would show what would happen if you wanted to maximize your amount of grass and do very little else. You'd still have to meet the guidelines in terms of minimum vegetation and having trees in the yard according to the code. But other than that, you could put 385 square feet, which would be prescriptive, meaning we said that you can have only a certain percentage of your yard, 10% in turf on a prescriptive option. So you could max that out. You could put mulch everywhere else, have your trees. You would cover enough of your landscape to qualify, and you would have about 5 gallons per square foot per season to water the yard. That would be with overhead irrigation. If you used drip, then that would change it to 4. Now, most people may want more landscape than mulch. So we looked at a couple other options just to show the possibilities that would be available to people. These are just examples. If you were doing a water budget, it allows a lot more creativity as opposed to a prescriptive option. In this case, if somebody did a low water native landscape, they would get a bonus. Vegetated swale for stormwater management, they would get another gallon. And then they could maximize the amount of turf if they wanted to. So they could put 1,000 square feet of turf grass in their yard. With 17 gallons per square foot per season, they would still manage to cover the allotted amount of ground with vegetation, and they would meet their water budget. If you wanted to do something like this strictly with drip irrigation, then it would also work, and you could add more medium water plants to your yard. So you would have maybe a little more vegetation in your yard, but you could still have a rather large backyard with grass in it. If you wanted to have a pool, that would also be possible by using low water plants or medium water plants in your yard, and it would kind of balance out what you have with your pool. This person wouldn't have any landscape bonuses because they didn't put in any of the special features that are incentivized, and would still make the water budget. And if you wanted a pool and grass, again, in this particular case, where no special bonuses in the type of landscaping, it's medium and low water, but you would still be able to have a patch of grass and a pool. So these are just some examples of how our water budget would calculate out if people decided to pursue it. It is written such that people can choose to just go straight with the code and meet a prescriptive option. So you don't have to do the water budget, but if you wanted more creativity, you could go this direction. Are there any questions about water budget?
Any questions?
Okay. The last thing I wanted to cover was a question that we often get about who has to comply. Again, we touched on this briefly in the last meeting. The colors are a little off on this for the main screen. So the yeses are intended to be green at the very bottom there. So the idea is that if we just pass the ordinance, but the property hasn't changed, that would not spur someone to come into compliance. You could be legal non-conforming. Adding a small garden, it wouldn't be big enough. Remodeling a bathroom is interior, so it wouldn't count. Adding an uncovered porch, like a little paved area, would also, it's not a modification to a structure. It would not spur you to come into compliance. But as soon as you needed like a building permit for a carport or something larger, that would be a modification to structure. And at that point, that or larger renovations to the home or larger changes over 50% to the landscape would also spur somebody to come into compliance with the entire landscape. Any questions on about when people would leave legal non-conforming and need to conform with the update?
The only question I have is when you're remodeling a bathroom, wouldn't you want them to use energy efficient water fixtures?
Next slide. The indoor water conservation standards are worded differently. So this section is for all lodging and new residential. So if you have an existing residential dwelling, you would not have to come into compliance the way it's currently worded, but a new one would. Existing lodging units or new lodging units would all have to come into compliance with the changes to the indoor water conservation standards. And this was our understanding of council direction combined with what we thought was enforceable, because getting into when that line of what kind of interior remodel spurs you to come into compliance, and whether changing your kitchen fixture makes you remodel your bathroom. We felt like those boundaries were very difficult to define and all the situations that could occur. So that's why we put the line between existing residential and new residential.
So is the existing lodging unit triggered when it's remodeled?
Well, the way it's, do you want to cover that one?
Sure. The language as it would read now is that it would, I think, trip over to that we haven't put it into that legal non-conform category, that they would now be in violation. So we'd have to come up with a mitigation option for them to improve those. That's the way the original Washington County language was designed. So it's pretty heavy.
Oh,
I would be very open to discussing further how we could incorporate what would be a legal legal non-conforming aspect or an amortization period. But the way it reads is existing lodging would have to come into compliance, which is a big lift.
Would existing lodging be like VRBOs, Airbnbs?
More hotel, motel, B&B, STRs, short-term rentals. So like
STRs.
Airbnbs and VRBOs would not. They're a residential structure that's being utilized differently. So lodging is what
Right.
we're
I was thinking it
considering.
was that STR, that any STR would have to be conforming.
I suppose we could look more deeply, and this is something I think we will be doing in the future as far as our land use update of how we're defining out STRs to OAs, overnight accommodations, or those other variants like boarding houses, lodging, or even the offset B&Bs, those types of elements. Typically within our compliance standards, we've broken them into a category of STRs are those that are developed and designed as a residential dwelling being utilized as a use for that short-term rental. Overnight accommodations are designed in a commercial aspect. So different building code books, the IRC versus the IBC is kind of the division code we have at the moment. Doesn't mean it has to stay that way. That's just how we've been operating at the moment.
But I where Caleb, I think is if this passed, then we would have to come up with some sort of timeline in saying that all lodging has to come in compliance with this if they're not already, which.
Right. So we're rapidly approaching that time period within our dark skies. Is within this ordinance, I think a really good cousin of this ordinance of the amortization period is coming to an end. And we know most of our properties have not come into compliance. So we're approaching that period pending us revising that dark sky, which we've already been working on. They would bring it into a legal non-conforming category, which would be really similar to the rest of this landscaping ordinance, meaning there is an expansion or a voluntary action towards compliance through expansion or redevelopment. So that would be I think a staff recommendation I'd make attached to this. We really haven't had the opportunity to discuss this provision at length until this moment. So this is something I think be easily brought into the rest of the context of this landscaping ordinance, but the way it was proposed, we wanted to leave that intact until we communicate with the council. So I would propose not an amortization, but a legal non-conforming, which would be in compliance with what our future dark sky proposed ordinance may likely look like. Did I lose anybody there?
Not me.
It's possible, I guess, in this context, existing lodging, that would be an immediate compliance or an immediate termination clause, which is consistent with some communities in their dark sky. I don't think we've experienced it other than this landscaping provision used in another county of how it's being dealt with there. And I think it's fairly young, so we don't know how that's actually worked. But I think we can make it our own and fold it into the process pretty well.
Thoughts?
I'd be reluctant to require immediate compliance.
Mhm.
That seems like potentially onerous. So I'd be inclined to have a reasonable amortization period or the route you proposed. And likewise on the existing residential dwelling, I'm wondering if it's logistically feasible to require that if they're doing a remodel that is replacing specific fixtures, that those fixtures be conforming without requiring like them to change things that are unaffected by the remodel.
It potentially, one of the challenges is which things are on plans when we receive them. So people don't usually spec like a washing machine if they're remodeling a laundry room. They, might say they're tearing out a wall or putting a new one in, but wouldn't necessarily tell us like which specific washing machine is going in there. And I think that is one of the challenges for us with reviewing new plans, even with the new ones and also with the existing ones.
And additionally, those often don't require building permits. So we don't have a reviewable period that would normally catch those types of minor, what we call maybe minor remodels or owner remodels even. You know, there are some improvements that a plumber should be doing or an electrician should be doing. Those don't always happen. They're sometimes owner completed. Most electrical permits, you need a permit. Just go get it. If you're changing a fixture, you should consult our building official. But as far as
If you're changing a plumbing fixture,
if what I'm saying is you do not. So if you're going to change a shower head, we don't require a permit for that. I think we all are on the same page. But to that very point, if maybe there were a shower head that may have been compliant upon the CO, it's very possible that person can now say, I really don't like the pressure. I'm going to take that off and put a non-compliant. We would have there's no process for us to have evaluated that. So as a whole, this removal of that remodel aspect without getting far more into depth with our building department and how they operate with inspections. I think this is the most achievable path at this point.
Mhm.
So Luke,
So regarding like the existing lodging and potential enforcement, yeah, I agree. I don't think kind of having it come immediately or required to come immediately into compliance is feasible or really just kind of. But in terms of like the options of having like some sort of like amortization period or like having it in the legal non-conforming like status. Like the concern that I have is that we do have a lot of really large hotels already existing. But some of the lodging things are also kind of like privately owned by like individual owners. And so with the size of some of these hotels, I think I'd like to try to push for coming into compliance like on some sort of deadline. I think they potentially would have like a bit more capacity to make those changes, coupled with the fact that per square footage for a lot of these like multi-story hotels, I'd say they probably would use more water on average than like a smaller unit or something like that. And is there any way to have some sort of distinction where like based on size or like turnover or revenue or something, some people are allowed to be in legal non-conforming while like other larger projects are kind of subject to an amortization period?
I think it'd be possible to draft something like that. Currently, we do not. All uses and all structures, kind of on the premise of do they comply or do they not, fall into the same category of how we approach that compliance. To step back, one's additional perspective with existing lodging units, most contemporary hotels, motels, or larger commercial IBC developed properties, most of these features, and I don't have the building official here to confirm, but my understanding is that I believe most of those fixtures, I don't know about all the appliances per se, are already meeting these standards.
No,
So I think it'd be less of a heavy lift, but I am nervous about putting any timeframes on. If that's the direction of the council, I completely understand. We can draft that. We're capable of doing that. But as where we have seen with dark skies, I think is a lesson that as staff we've learned, and that would be what we're coming to you in this new update is to consider amending those original amortization structures. Not to say that compliance isn't a goal and that we haven't set those goals, but immediate termination at the end of a 5-year period, which is what dark skies was, is going to have implications. I think it's going to be directly correlated to the same type of developments. Those that are non-compliant with lighting are likely possibly going to have non-compliance of fixtures. So when we say, okay, you're going to have to come in, now you're footing a bill for however many rooms times that many fixtures that they have to change, it's going to be a heavy bill. But if it is a voluntary adjustment to the property, that gives us a lot more capacity to enforce and bring them into compliance. I think without putting ourselves at too much risk of being onerous.
Okay. Yeah, and that reminds me that we were talking at the planning commission that rather than kind of leading with this stick, that there is room for carrots. And there's potentially like grant funding or something where we can help offset the cost of replacing fixtures and all of that. So that makes sense.
I think the staff, I think we're excited about this provision. What I'm nervous of is if we try to do too much too quickly, I'm not saying we couldn't grab maybe more than we might right off the bat, but it might be a more of an uphill battle to get there.
Anybody else? So did you feel like you got enough information to move forward? Or I'm not
The-
sure I did, but
I think what we would like to do with this particular provision is come up with a legal non-conforming for existing lodging.
That was what I
That's my
needed.
understanding. Okay.
okay.
And I did not have any notes for any other changes. I have notes on questions, but
I was kind of curious why, if you're including lodging in that, why not include all commercial properties? You know, like restaurants,
Sure.
you know, information center,
That's it.
you know,
I think that's a worthwhile question maybe for the council, because I think from staff, we're supporting possible directions that has been in the communication so far. That is highlighting what is an existing framework. That's why these two are profiled, is that we've taken them from an existing approved framework somewhere else. It isn't to say that we couldn't expand, change, which we have. We've already amended a bit of that framework with the.
and I'm not
remodel.
saying we should, I'm just saying.
Yeah, worth
Like, it seems like
contemplating.
you're going after the, you know, the kind of the for-profit, you know, folks, you know,
Mhm.
and, you know, I don't know, I feel like I don't know, it's kind of singling out one.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not for it or against it, I'm just wondering why, you know, 'cause I think there's a lot of lodging, and lodging uses water,
Sure.
but also lodging doesn't use as much water as locals.
Sure.
Can wait for you to answer.
Sure. That seems like a very valid kind of rhetorical statement almost of what should we all be doing? I think to clarify that this wasn't directly staff generated. We're accommodating this from an existing framework from another community. So I think we're absolutely open to that. I think given our number of properties devoted for that particular industry, it makes sense versus some of the other variable areas. But I also, like I said earlier, think most of these existing properties are already potentially in or very close to compliance with this provision. And those that maybe are historically out of compliance, maybe it's worth evaluating those. If many of those fixtures are not compliant, that's a lot of faucets and a lot of fixtures that could be worth bringing into compliance.
Ronnie?
Along those lines, thanks for that question, Jason, I guess. Is there data available to us as council about, say, if we looked across the board at commercial, about what the largest comparative water uses are? It just seems like to make a informed decision that might help us. I don't know if there's information like that available. I guess then, yeah.
It'll be according, the data we have is going to be from the treasurer's office, and it'll be building data. So it'll be precise, but I don't know if it's necessarily categorized by industry, or if it's just commercial versus residential.
I seem to remember like an old site at 2018 even. It was when we were doing some of the overnight accommodation evaluations that I think there were some numbers around. But again, that data is at this point going to be somewhat antiquated for this conversation. But it had existed at one point, but I think like
So I guess
city manager is saying it's
one of the questions is there've been several articles in the past year, as communities look at, different things to do, especially as water might be running low. One of the information sources they use is at trying to inform themselves about where the higher versus the lower use is. So I don't know if that's information we could get, but if so, it seems like it'd be helpful. I guess the other question is, what would it take for us to have a better sense of how many, say with the existing lodging are out of compliance? Is that a heavy lift, or is that relatively easy to find out?
I'm wondering,
Yeah.
discussing with the building official. Of course, all of our current permits will know
Yeah.
more or less, I think, pretty well, because again, we weren't reviewing these.
Yeah.
But I think they would have a pretty good sense, but I'm guessing upon the IBC standards of which they were developed, there, I think, are some specific regulations that speak to that. And again, this is not necessarily my field, but
Yeah.
so as far as exact numbers in total, probably a bit of a heavy lift, but to create some sense, we might be able to come back with some commentary, at least within the last 5 years of maybe what that might mean.
Okay, and I guess the last question is for Carly. Is there anything going on with the water utility resource management plan that crosses over with this and would help inform us in the direction we take?
That's a really good question. I think this is definitely consistent with any sort of water resource management planning. Conservation is one tool that you use when you're talking about demand management, especially outdoor irrigation. Like indoor non-discretionary water use, like cooking, cleaning, bathing, that's a really tiny percentage of the water that we use. And it's also non-discretionary. We want to make sure there's plenty of that available because it's part of public health and public safety. So the fact that it's sort of addressing this heavy water user in outdoor irrigation, I think is very promising. And I don't see anything being produced from our water resource management planning efforts that would contradict this effort. I think it's totally consistent.
Okay, thanks. Those are my questions. Anybody else?
So sorry, I missed the last meeting. So if this is redundant, and you've already discussed it ad nauseum, tell me to move on. But on water features, a couple things. Wind shutoff devices are required. And so I tried to go shopping for a wind shutoff device for like a residential pond with a little fountain, and I couldn't find any. I'm wondering, did I just not know where to look, or is this something that's readily available?
I think if our consultants are on, this was one of the recommendations they gave us. We talked a lot about whether water features are allowed or not allowed and like what provisions we would want if they are. So we decided not to say you can't have one, but that you should have like a pool cover and some things like that. Lindsay, Victoria, do you want to add to wind shut off?
Hey, yep, this is Victoria. Lindsay had to jump off. Yeah, in terms of wind shut off features for the water features, I think that's something that, I know it are available. Of course, definitely depends on your location and where you're sourcing your water feature from or who's putting it together or building it. But I know that is a recommendation that we pulled from another community that has had success implementing their landscaping ordinance with that provision of wind shut off features for the water features. So if it'd be helpful, we can definitely look into what some of those features are like and where you could get those local to the Moab area, if not online.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. And also maybe an estimate of how much they save and maybe having an irrigation factor in essence, if you have them or not.
Yeah, perfect. I could definitely look into that, and we will pull together some of those manufacturer specifications to share with council.
Great. And then on point D says where available, recycled water is recommended as a source for decorative water features. Is that intended as secondary?
I think the intention is that any fountain or something that the water can be continuously used within the same feature. That would be preferable.
Because it's point A says recirculating water systems shall be used.
Okay.
And so I have the impression, but they require topping off just because they evaporate.
Mm-hmm.
And so and it would make sense that it would be secondary water, but recycled, it seems like a particular subcategory of secondary,
Like gray,
which can be potable or non-potable.
Or like gray water.
gray water still comes to mind, not necessarily secondary.
But it seems like secondary is the defined sort of catch-all for non-potable.
We can be more specific with that. We can consult also. We can talk to our consultants about like being more specific about gray water versus secondary water, or whether we would be trying to include both.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And then on the irrigation system criteria, dedicated landscape water meter sub-meter shall be installed for certain criteria. And I wasn't clear if that was a water meter of the water provider or just a meter that attached to the smart irrigation controller and either gave feedback that it was operating out of the flow parameters or had an automatic shut off if it exceeded?
Mhm.
And were you clear on what the intent was? Like, is it a water provider meter or a user meter?
I'm gonna ask a consultant on that one too, who the provider would be. The intention is that you would know within all of the water you're using, what would be used at your irrigation.
Yep.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yep, can you actually pull up that section of the ordinance just to make sure I'm looking at the right place? But yeah, in terms of that, yeah, sub meters are on the current irrigation system. There are some end user, so the customer meters that are available that, yeah, as you mentioned, just kind of you just attach to your current meter and it provides you with some real-time water use data. I just want to make sure that in the ordinance that we were clear on who we were, asking to install those sub meters. And let me see where that was very quickly and give me one moment. Perfect. Thank you for pulling that up. Yeah, I think what we can do here is we can get more specific on, what we mean by who will be installing these and what the intent of these are as we come back with the ordinance next time.
Okay, great. And then this is down in the review procedures. And there's number C, exemptions, and except as noted otherwise by special circumstance, the provision of the general standard 17.30.10 shall not apply to, and then there's a list of, so is that the general irrigation standards? The 17.30.10
This
didn't
is,
seem to line up with the current numbering of the version, at least of the version that I have.
it would cover this new landscape piece, that the provisions in this would not apply to active recreation areas as it is written now.
Right, so does that mean that like it doesn't need to meet the water budget and so forth?
Yes, it would not have to meet the water budget. It wouldn't have to meet anything in here that we're
Okay.
requiring, like the minimum plants, things like that.
So I'm wondering if, like, I can understand why it might be exempt, these might be exempted from the water budget, and I'm fine with that, but it seems like they would be good areas to have smart controllers, so that even if, because they're using potentially significantly more water, it would be good if they were still being efficient and that they had high distribution uniformity and well-designed systems. And so it seems like
Right.
requiring some elements of the general standards.
So potentially having irrigation applied to these at the minimum.
Right, but maybe not the water budget.
Right. Or some of the other landscaping things that are not really aimed at
Right,
active
or
recreation.
particular
Okay,
prescriptive requirements as far as plants.
we can be specific about either which things apply or a list of things that don't apply. Okay.
If that makes sense, and
Mhm.
I like that.
Mhm. Anything else, Caleb?
let's see. One more thing. There was a procedure for a way you can request exemptions. And down at the end, it says, upon receipt of a complete application for an exemption, the zoning administrator shall prepare a statement to recommend that the exception be approved or denied. And then it goes on. And I wasn't clear on who they were recommending to, or is that just like they're not submitting, they make the determination, but that's just their documentation,
Mhm.
should it come up. I wasn't clear what the like hierarchy of authority is for this.
We've restructured this a couple of times based on the land use authority structure. At the planning commission, I believe at our last planning commission meeting, we had discussed the fact that the land use authority, being the planning commission or city council in some effects, would probably be referring to the zoning administrator or Alexi in most of these cases as the staff professional, for lack of a better term, on the conditions. So that recommendation's coming from her, and why would we put that out if it's potentially just going to be get back to her? I think is where we had landed on that. Is that correct?
I think so. But as far as who the statement would be going to, I think it would be at this point, a documentation of.
Is it my understanding that the zoning administrator is making the recommendation to the land use authority? Whoever that might be, because again, like say an MPD, that's going to be the city council. If it's a site plan, it might be the planning commission. If it's a
Mhm.
level 1 site plan, it might be just staff itself, which will
Yeah.
be the zoning administrator.
Okay.
Sorry, that I want to make sure I was covering the right base there, because there are variable approval sets.
Mhm.
Okay, that's it for my questions.
Thanks, Kaylin. So, we're coming on an hour, so I'm just gonna go ahead and wrap it up for now. So this will be on the council's agenda, at our next meeting for consideration. And if you guys wouldn't mind preparing, in your agenda summary, the things that were changed so that it's real clear of, what was discussed tonight. It sounds to me like we're just gonna be focused on residential and lodging and not overall commercial. We can always amend that later down the road and we'll see how this works. So that would be great. And thank you guys for your time and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Great,
you.
Well, we'll
thank
see
you.
you, Alexi, in a
I
minute.
know, you hang around. Like I don't.
Mayor, can I
apologize.
just request a 3 to 4 minute break?
Sure.